Welcome to the Doggy Dojo. I'm your host, Susan Light, a Los Angeles-based dog trainer on a quest to become worthy of the title Sensei of the Doggy Dojo. Today we're talking about non-food motivated dogs. Positive reinforcement training has a reputation for being totally reliant on treats and food. But although food is an easy and convenient way to reach a lot of dogs, it's far from the only positive thing in their life, which means it's not the only option to positively reinforce behavior we'd like to see more of. My guest is the founder of the ZEN DOG and host of the popular show Dog Impossible, the second season of which is set to air on Disney Plus and National Geographic Wild this month. We're going to talk about why some dogs aren't food motivated, go through some of the many other options available to reinforce our dogs, and how using these non-food reinforcers changes our approach to a training session. Please welcome Matt Beisner. Matt, welcome to the podcast.
Oh, thank you. It's really great to be here.
I'm so excited to talk about this because as positive reinforcement trainers, I think everybody, that means treats to everybody. And people's concerns are mostly that their dogs will become dependent on treats. I already have done an episode about that. But we, as trainers and some owners, have been running into dogs that just don't seem to want to work for treats, don't seem to be food motivated. So I love that we're going to talk about other ways to motivate them.
Yeah, it's something that I stumbled into, I think, like a lot of things, and subsequently have a lot more information on and education on. And I'm really glad in hindsight that I took a deep dive into what happens if a dog doesn't respond and how can we engage that dog, positively reinforce that dog in different ways, because now it's become a really valuable part of my skill set as I get a lot more comfortable, ironically, with the utilization of food, which typically I think 8 out of 10 dogs will respond to food first, but that's not how my story started.
Yeah. So what are some of the reasons why those 2 out of 10 dogs might not be responding to food?
Well, we may see dogs that have experiences where they had responded to food. I'll give you an example. I recently worked with a client who's had gone to a widely known national chain for support, and built into that training, there was a lot of use of aversives and e-collars. So the food in that case for that dog has become poisoned. In fact, so had the owners. They needed help because the dog was actually attacking them, and they'd reach for a leash and the dog would attack them. And so really the whole thing had just become terribly poisoned. But the food itself had a pretty profound negative association. So there are cases like that. You might see a dog that is willing to be lured into something, but that's not the same thing as it being able to practice agency at a higher level. And that dog then is reasonably suspicious. Oh, I got lured into this crate and then the crate door closed and then you left me here for hours to bark it out, which, in transparency, that's something that I used to do and I didn't think anything of it. And so I can see that there are cases too where dogs, for whatever reason, could be genetics. I think a lot about Kim Brophy's work, learning and environment and genetics, and then the self that is the dog. But the dogs just don't seem to respond to food. And then there are plenty of cases where a dog may ultimately be food motivated, and maybe even primarily food motivated at its root, if that's the right way to say it. But the stress levels are so high that it's not going to respond at all. So we've got to find something else. I work with a lot of dogs in that window who love to smell. So that's a great way for us to get into a positive association and some activity and some potential teaching.
Yeah, that's awesome. What about dogs that are just overfed, maybe free fed? So by the time we get to trying to work with training, they're not super hungry, they're not super interested, they're not super motivated. Is that ever a situation you run into?
Yeah, sometimes. I'm glad you brought that up because that can be easily overlooked. There is, I think, to your point at the top, there's a general understanding. I wouldn't even call it understanding. There's a general way of thinking that positive reinforcement is treat only. That's not true. And there's also a general way of thinking wherein owners assume that dogs will want food, particularly treats, all the time. Also not true. Yeah. I really like glazed old-fashioned donuts. I don't want them all the time.
You don't?
Not all the time. Not for lack of trying.
Right.
So that matters a lot. A dog, we're not talking about like starving a dog, obviously, but a dog is more likely to work for food when they haven't just eaten. And so on and so forth.
Absolutely. So do you find we're talking about Kim Brophy and Kim came on the podcast. Thank you, Kim. Do you find any breeds tend to be more prone to not being food motivated?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I don't know that I've ever given that thought. And I wonder what Kim's take is on that, or anybody's take, but I would say no. I guess the answer to that is no. I haven't thought to observe that.
So that hasn't shown up in your practice that you've noticed, oh, wow, all the Huskies, Shibas, ancient breeds seem to be, not so interested in the food.
Not categorically. I didn't identify it that way, but that sure would be interesting. Probably could have made my work a lot easier if I had gotten smart on that too.
Yeah, I wonder if anybody's looking into that. Mental note. So do you ever recommend troubleshooting the food and trying to figure that out first, like trying more high value treats, reducing meals, etc. first, or would you jump straight to like, hey, there's other things we can do, it doesn't have to be food?
That's a great question. I think it depends on what the immediate circumstances are. So at this point in my work with a lot of dogs that display aggressive behavior, which is an important differentiation than labeling a dog as dog aggressive or this dog is aggressive. The behavior is not who the individual is. So if we are in, I'm very careful nowadays to help a dog be in an environment where it doesn't feel compelled to act in aggressive ways. And generally 90% of aggression is fear-based, and most aggression, or a lot of aggression I see, is about creating space. So the dog might come at to actually have me back up. But if we're not in that type of, if I'm not in a setup that's not really in favor of the dog, and we're looking at, an urgent situation or a triage, then we'll take what we can find to help the dog that's not going to hurt the dog. But I don't go into those situations, and I don't intentionally set those situations up anymore. So what we may do is, in fact, I know what I'm going to do at any point in any work I do nowadays. I'm going to start with observation, because there's a lot that I need to understand about how the dog is processing and learning. A rule of thumb, an appropriate rule of thumb in the scientific world is that the learner decides. So we'll see what the dog does and doesn't respond to. But before I even get into that, I want to just see things about the dog, whether it's vocalizations or physical tells in the body. How does this dog learn and process and experience things? And usually in an early conversation with somebody virtually or in the home, I see a lot about the interactions between the humans and the dog or dogs in the home that tell me why some behaviors are likely repeating, that they're unintentionally being reinforced. So we start to, as we take a step back and just work from observation first, we get an opportunity to see where we might be able to meet the dog where it's at. I get feedback, for example, my dog loves to smell, or I will note that when I come in, the dog is hesitant. And then when I change my position and move to a different place, the dog goes to smell where I was. Okay, so there may be something there. Sometimes that's a displacement behavior, but there may be something there for that dog, and that's how that dog needs to process this new person being in there. So I think the short answer to your question is it will depend on the dog, and I will see what the dog will respond to and understand that there are values to it. So a piece of kibble is going to be different than a piece of cheese. It just seems to be for dogs, steak, chicken, cheese, that's typically, that
Yeah.
typically seems to
Yeah.
be on the menu,
I usually
So
say smelly and something that will go bad if you leave it out
yeah,
is
yeah,
what I would call like a high value
yeah.
treat.
That's a cool way to classify it.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I want to see too, when we're thinking about what else the humans can do, one of the things that I explored a lot was use of tone and, like verbal praise as a general category, physical praise. Those have values too. I recognize they're secondary reinforcers, but they can become, dogs can respond to them as primary, if we're using them appropriately. So
I love that.
I want to explore the value of whatever's available to help this dog help itself.
That's so great. And it's funny when you say, these behaviors you're watching, they're repeating because the people don't know that they're accidentally reinforcing it. And
Mm.
that really proves that the dog values things that aren't treats, because they're
Mm.
not going around giving the dog treats for doing things they don't want them to do, but they're reinforcing it in other ways. So obviously there are other things that the dog values. So you're saying, the tone, the verbal praise,
Mm-hmm.
what other things are we going down this list now to see what we might be able to use to motivate a dog?
Well, certainly play. Dr. Amy Cook, has done an amazing job with her program, The Playway, and that play in a lot of cases is undervalued and underutilized. And the use of smell, and I found also one of the things I was really fortunate to have at our facility in LA was a space where dogs could learn how to interact, or could be given the opportunity to interact. And my wife Brooklin and I, we have 5 of our own at this point, which I'm not recommending to any of your listeners, but probably a lot of your listeners may have a lot of dogs in their home. We have dogs that demonstrated that they were very socially gifted. And so we had the privilege, and I use that word intentionally, to watch these dogs help other dogs socialize. And that was a profound experience, I would judge, for a lot of the dogs that came into our facility needing help of some sort. And one of the things that stood out to me is how they would often generalize. I'll use the word confidence, or the practice of agency, how they would often generalize the positive experience they had into other areas. And if somebody, this is kind of a sidebar, but if you or somebody can quantify this for me, this would be great. But the anecdotal experience is, I brought a dog to a vet, for example. She was a client's dog, and I brought her to the vet on behalf of the client. And the staff at the vet's office said, we almost didn't recognize her because she seems so much more relaxed. Now, we had never done any work at the vet with this dog, but what this dog had was regular, consistent, respectful interactions with humans, and a lot of really great time with really well socialized dogs. And somehow that carried over. That's kind of fascinating. And I got that
awesome
feedback from people a lot.
Yeah, that's great. So also, when you say play, are you talking about giving them toys? Because I think you're talking about letting them play with the other dogs, right?
Well, that's one aspect of it. And I know that's not available to a lot of people, especially during COVID and even some cases afterwards. The play with the dog will depend on what the dog responds to. And obviously, if there's a resource guarding behavior here, we'd have to be mindful about it. Some dogs, I just kind of leave it up to their individual taste. I mean, that's what I refer to. So if the dog likes to play fetch, but the dog never drops it, then maybe I'll bring a second ball in, and we can kind of create a positive reinforcement, positive association, where when you bring the ball to me and you drop it, something good happens, i.e., you get to go after that ball again. If that's what seems to be fitting for the dog. And by fitting, I mean not get the dog so cracked out that now we're dealing with other impulses that we've reinforced. Tug, I used to have strong opinions on tug. I try not to have strong opinions on things anymore unless they're scientifically sound. And Foraging is great. We've got a German Shepherd that's with us, and she likes it when I'm drying her. She seems to like it when I pull a towel out. She wants to come bite at the towel. And when I get a package, she wants to go into get her nose all in the package. And so I will intentionally open up make sure I've got a package that I'm going to quote open, and I'll have a towel in there, and then I'll pull it out and she'll get to investigate it. I call her my admin assistant, and she will she'll give it the works. And so I see what the dog's interested in. Some dogs, they like to self-play, and for some dogs, it's the squeaky toys. And again, just trying to see what the dog responds to. And a lot of that I can get from, a lot of the direction on that I can get from talking with the dog's humans. And I always am asking, what does your dog like and respond to and want to do? Because so much of the focus is, understandably, my dog's behavior is wrong, and will you please help me fix it? And as you know from talking to Kim, that is an understandable but outdated way of looking at things, pretty limiting in that way. So as I'm debriefing, kind of the clinical word is, I'm just talking with the dog's humans about what the dog likes to do. We find that even in the thick of all of this undesired behavior, and I put that in quotes, the dog is clearly demonstrating what it responds to and where it has some impulses. So there's stuff that we can build on that are readily available to us if I'm listening and paying attention.
And is it a little bit about changing the way you're viewing that interaction or that training session, that, if I've got my treat pouch and I'm like, okay, let's go through touch, let's go through look, give me some downs, let's do some reps of these things. If we're dealing with a dog that's not food motivated and we're going to use play as a reinforcer, is it more about engaging the dog and then you're asking for one thing while you pause the play and then make it continue? Does the emphasis shift a bit?
Yeah, what you just described is exactly how I do it. If I find that the dog is not really interested in that, I've got 2 kids. My son's almost 5. My daughter's a year and a half. And I see the same thing. I think there's a lot of parallels. Andrew Hale talks a lot, based on his experience in clinical work with human beings and psychology, talks a lot about the parallels, and that we would do well to really think about the dog's capacity to think in some ways and feel like we do. So if this is what if the dog wants to play, and we know that play is an excellent way to learn, arguably for humans, one of the most effective ways to learn, then we'll play, and then we'll have a pause, and I might capture and praise the move that the dog just did. I might not even be thinking about teaching you how to sit, but you come over. I know that would be on the owner's wish list, for example, but you brought me this thing, and then you sat down, and I'll say, good sit, boom. And then we can start to, and then sure enough, I find the dog comes over and sits the next time and starts to piece together behavior. It's one way that I've learned to be cagey about what I can help a dog learn.
Yeah, but it's different than saying like, oh, I'm going to hold this ball, now sit, and doing some reps. Okay, now you can play again. It's just a different way to look at the emphasis of the session, if you will.
Yeah, it is. And I think it's also, maybe this is part of your point, and it's certainly something that I'm interested in, and that is, what's the difference between training and teaching? And, the way I present it, and, to people like Mike Scaccio and Kim Brophy and Andrew Hale, and, a slew of people that I've been really fortunate to be able to connect with. Big shout out to Emily Strong and Ali Bender, and Trish McMillan's been a great support, and Dee Holt. And so as I'm just kind of asking questions and, pinging these ideas off of people, there's the thing that seems to be true about training is that I come in with a set idea of what needs to happen and a set of tools to apply to achieve set goal, which means if I take a step back at it, really it's just about me. So here's this thing that I think needs to have happen, which I can make happen, which the clients want me to make happen, and it's mine, and I'm going to give it to you, and you're going to follow it because it's mine. That's what you should do. Now that way of thinking is open to heavily aversive trainers, it's open to balance trainers, it's open to positive reinforcement trainers. That construct doesn't discriminate. Obviously, what happens in it can be quite a different experience for the dog. But if I'm teaching, if we think about, I would offer the spirit of education as it is intended. It's about you having something that empowers you. Mm. It's about you being able to make it your own. So I've not been comfortable for a while calling myself a trainer, and I feel a little bit like, feels a little too LA for me to call myself a dog teacher. You know? but I think really more than anything, what I'm doing now when I go into a home is observing the dog, so I can learn something about how the dog learns, so I can help the dog learn something it seems to need to learn. Mm. But you can't put that on a business card.
Yeah, it's sort of the same way as we're not really calling them commands anymore. We're calling them cues. Yeah. Because, we're changing the way we're thinking about dogs having consent and mm-hmm. agency. And, we're not commanding them. We would like to shape their behavior a little bit in our situations, which is what I love about what Kim does as well, is her saying, you can shape some, but they have needs. And if they're not in the right, if you got the wrong ball, as she says, for what you're mm-hmm. doing, it's not going to work out ever. Yeah.
Yeah. I want to go back to something that you had posed earlier about the owners unintentionally reinforcing, and the dog might have there's a positive reinforcement there. In a lot of cases, there's a negative reinforcement. So the dog will do this so that doesn't happen. And a really common example of this is people ask the dog to sit and then they pet their dog, and in their mind they've just rewarded the sit. But if we watch the dog's behavior, what is quite likely is that the dog is sitting, mm-hmm. and if we look at how they're sitting, and then we look at the tucked tail or the eyes or the ducked head or the pinned ears, and we look at how they're receiving the affection, it's plausible, if not factual, that the dog is allowing that to happen so that what comes after that doesn't happen. I'm going to let you do this so that I'm done with the pressure that's being put on me.
That's such a good point, because I do think when you're saying, praise can be a reinforcer, and certainly affection can be, but it's so mm-hmm. important to read the dog's body language and know if they're enjoying it.
Yeah.
We're going to take a short break, but you can find Matt on social media. He's on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube. All those links are in the show notes. His website is www.thezendog.com, and you can check out the new season of Dog Impossible on Disney Plus or National Geographic Wild. We'll be right back. We were just talking about how using play specifically mm-hmm. as the reinforcer changes the way you approach the session. Mm-hmm. So it's less about like, let me give you this command, here is your reward, which is play, instead of a treat, and more about what's going to engage the dog, and then take maybe small breaks during it to find a way to capture and reward and shape.
Yeah, that's one way to go about it. Yeah, Kathy Murphy is a part of the BTO posse, as I call them, the Beyond the Operant posse. She's fascinating to listen to, and I hope to be able to have a conversation with her at some point soon, because what got me thinking about it is the way you're describing this particular on the fly approach. Okay, this dog wants to play. Okay, so what can we learn in the course of the play? I would bet, and I'd be really curious to see what the scan or the neurological feedback indicates on this. There's a difference between engaging, in this case, and the learning that where the brain is at in its receptivity to what it is then going to learn in that moment, mm-hmm. than were I to teach the dog to sit. If we could just see like that response, that must have been documented at some point, and I just haven't seen it yet. But also, to your point about commands and cues, I don't think it's just a rebranding, which certainly happens in our field. I would venture, I spent a lot of time studying the human voice, actually, many years. And it was just a fascinating world for me to live in and work in. And I have found it to be really helpful in my work with dogs. If I said to somebody, I want you to command me to sit, And then if I said to that same person, now I want you to cue me to sit, I bet that the tone of voice is distinctly different.
I bet.
And if I'm a dog and I'm listening to everything that I can to figure out how this world works so that, as Andrew Hale says, I can get safety and relief, then I will likely respond better to a cue than a command.
Yeah. That's so interesting. Now I can't remember. It might have been The Other End of the Leash. I'm not sure which book I was reading, that she was postulating that, dogs can learn some of our language. Obviously, they're associating it, if we're very consistent. But she said when people get confused, they're like, no, they know sit. But it's like sit and sit and sit. It's like, it's so different that it's very possible the dog doesn't realize that's the same word.
Yeah.
So it's sometimes our inconsistencies, especially in tone, that's causing a lot of confusion when we're trying to communicate.
Yeah, it's an excellent point. I think for humans, not 94% of communication is nonverbal. So if we look at the state of the world that we're in.
For humans? Wow.
I believe so. Yeah, I definitely love backup on that, but that's what I was told by somebody.
Wow.
Who I think knows more than me. And if 94% is nonverbal, then, and we're only using X amount of the brain, then you can see why us trying to build a world in which we can all live based on 6% of our ability or use of how we communicate. And then you add in languages and cultural differences, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, you can see how that doesn't really work. So from a dog's perspective, if they can understand X number of words specific to tone and volume and context, yeah, it would be really, really difficult to be a dog.
Oh, man. It is a good way to think of it, as you're dropped in the middle of a country where you don't speak the language and you're trying to find your way around. It's a good way. They're trying really hard to understand what we're saying, and they can't always. I wanted to say though, so we talked about play. Since we're on tone of voice, that was another thing you'd mentioned that can become very reinforcing. You're talking possibly about like a marker cue, like a good boy, yes, like a yes kind of thing.
Yeah, good boy, yes. Yes is pretty clean. Yeah, to your earlier point, Denise Fenzi had an interesting thing recently on one of her live Instagrams where she was talking about, she was aware for her in the difference of the word, the clip of the word, what we're talking about right now, the volume when it was being asked, and that there was a clear distinction in the dog's behavior. And so she had learned to be very intentional about what words she used, whatever they were going to be, so that she didn't run the risk of confusing the dog. Yeah.
And that's so hard to be that specific as humans.
Yep.
It's very hard for us.
Yeah. And I think, there's something for the dogs too, that, I see it in my own home. I talk to them in sentences, and I know I'm not alone in that. So hey, come on, love, let's go outside. I don't need to cue outside. Let's go out. Come on, love, let's go outside. So the tone can certainly, in the timing, the placement of it can become a marker. And I like yes, because it's quick. I love being in the yard. I call it the yard, the space we had at our facility in LA to watch dogs socialize, because it's like there's just so much love and encouragement, and we're not using aversives, and we're not using food in those circumstances, because that's not where I want to utilize that for dogs that are in there learning to socialize at that time. There's just so much yes and good and yeah, that kind of stuff, that it's just really sometimes very intentional, and sometimes it's just enthusiastic, because it's just amazing to see these dogs unfold. There's a lot that we have in us and on us that we can do to help a dog in this world.
So let's talk about another one that I learned from Grisha Stewart that dogs can find reinforcing, especially a fearful dog, which is getting some distance between whatever the stressor / trigger, whatever you want to call it, is. So that's part of BAT, which is obviously Grisha Stewart's program that she set up. But that's something we can use. That's another non-food reinforcement, correct?
Yeah, it is. It's one of the things that I unfortunately, I was late, and I'm probably 12 years into my work, and that's been in the later part of my work that I paid attention to that, and I wish it had been otherwise. And particularly, I recognize and take responsibility that I'm a public figure, and there's a show out, and plenty of people will learn, quote, dog training from a show rather than from certified professionals. So I have some, I'm on a mission in part to really, clarify and rectify some things. And one of the things that's so key, come back to safety and relief. An animal needs to know that it can make the perceived threat go away or go away from the threat. So if we think of it just in terms of pressure, I think, we might understand that as dog trainers, and dogs certainly can express that. Threat, I think, is another way to word it. If we think about it that way, being able to go away from the threat is a great idea. It's a great relief. And the point, and this is fascinating to me, and certainly a lot more for me to learn on this, that the point at which the dog is able to clear out of there, physically clear out of there, and express some kind of curiosity or engagement to even to turn around and look, and perhaps take a few steps closer. That kind of window where the dog is of its own agency, basically doing edge work. It's really fascinating, because we're not dealing with, I think we are right principally to put as little force or negativity on an experience for a dog as possible. And in doing so, it's fascinating to watch the dogs navigate their own stress, and some they'll get too close. For example, we're talking about distance, they'll get too close and then they'll clear out and then they're done. And that's great. And then they're done. And some they need like 3 or 4. I've seen dogs take over the course of an hour. I'm going to step away, I'm going to step back and step away and step back. And by the end of the hour, they are playing full on off leash playing with this other well socialized dog. But that was the space and the time that they needed. And I don't know why that dog, what it was about that dog, that it was, I'm probably speaking too generally when I say managing its stress, but there was something about that, I'll put in quotes, the edge work that dog was doing with itself in this safe environment that we would set up, that was, that's how that behavior showed up.
And it's so great that you're talking about letting the dogs, this is when we're talking about the agency and the consent, right? Because
correct.
That was a positive hour. Not saying that every dog will make that kind of progress in an hour, but certainly pushing a dog into a situation where they're uncomfortable can create problems and set you and the dog way, way back.
Yeah.
So that's such a great way to approach everything, is giving them space, giving them time. But I think this is the problem. A lot of people don't understand canine body language.
Yeah, it's easy. I mean, the first bite I had, it was Halloween, and the 3 adults in the yard said it was a good idea to approach the German Shepherd because the tail was wagging, and the German Shepherd did not think that was a good idea. So what did I heard not long ago that when the tail wags, when the dog sees somebody that apparently it recognizes and has a positive association with, that the tail wags slightly to the left. And I just thought, good Lord, like that's so much nuance.
Wow.
That, we can't reasonably be expected to track that, but there's so much to look at. And the thing that's really important in what you're saying, Susan, is that if we're looking, it actually means that we've paused. We're not doing, we're not enforcing, we're not commanding, we're not demanding, we're looking, which means we're actually in the practice of observation. And that's where our dogs can get a break. And that's where we can really, where we can have breakthroughs. And a lot of stuff, this stuff's so amazing and beautiful and profound. And as I was saying with Kim, she and I talked recently, and I said, like when I started, it was compassion and aggression, and I had 2 of those things, and I had to let go of the aggression, and what we're left with is something that's practical and applicable compassion. But it's just hard. It's hard to see dogs in those situations, and I wish I hadn't set them up in those situations over time. And I'm indebted to them.
We're all learning. you know? We're all changing as we, what they say, when you know better, you do better, right?
Well, some do.
We try.
Kind of blanket statement, but yeah.
Yeah.
And I think what's important too that I've heard with with people you're speaking, even just in yourself on your podcast, is you're one of those people that shares their growth publicly, and I think that is a really important modeling. I want to say that to you that for I think maybe for other professionals and any just dog caretakers and humans that live with them, that nobody knows all of it, and that all of us are in a process of learning how to do more of what we think is best for this dog.
Absolutely. And as long as we're continuing to learn, it'll be better every day, hopefully.
Yeah.
But thank you. That means a lot. Did I miss any? Are there any other reinforcers that you find useful?
Well, sniffing, man, sniffing is awesome.
Let's talk about that.
Sniffing is awesome.
If they're not offering sniffing, generally I teach sniffing with treats, with Find It, right?
Yeah, I think that's a way in for a lot of people.
So is that an indication that the dog is sniffing motivated instead of food motivated, if they want to take them off the ground instead of out of your hand?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I don't actually know. What I do, I think the context, kind of to your question, the context in which the sniffing is happening matters. So if I'm sitting in the chair and we have a shy or fearful dog and I get up and move and then the dog comes over and sniffs where I was, it could be displacement behavior. It could be how that dog needs to process. Do you know who Sarah Fisher is?
That name's not familiar.
I just got turned on to her through one of the Beyond the Operant posts, and she's out in the UK, and her center is ACE, Animal Centered Education, I believe, and she is just doing just like next level and Jedi level work in terms of her observational skills. And so she talks even about the positioning of the dog when it's doing the action as part of the context that we have to understand. So it's not just that the dog's sniffing. What's the body telling us about how it's sniffing? How perhaps the emotional experience is that is included with the sniffing. What's the dog stationing compared to its orientation with what else is in the yard? If we're looking at dog social, for example, a dog that if the helper dog is not drinking water, even though that helper dog is not acting out, the fact that it's not drinking water on a warm day during socialization might be an indication to me that this dog is not emotionally interested in engaging. So back to your specific question, where that treat lands and how we go from there, I think there's a lot to look at with that. And I have seen a lot of dogs that as they just had generally more positive associations and became what I would judge, more comfortable and confident in their behavior, in who they are as dogs, but in that direction, they started to sniff more and engage more. I've seen dogs. I had a dog that didn't play for the first 4 years of his life, other than the other dog that he lived with, and he came to our space for 3 years, and then he played. It was amazing. So, I don't know why that opened up. So with the sniffing and the use of it, sometimes like the value with the treats, I just didn't find the right environment. Asking you to smell a steak, when you got a stranger knocking at the door, probably not going to fly. But if I give you a better setup and I find something that's activating or at the very least interesting to you, then I might go with things that you were talking about earlier. Maybe I got to increase the distance, or what can I do to arrange myself in the environment so that you can actually get your sniff on?
Yeah. Well, as I'm learning more and more, it's all about adjustments. It's all about changing up the criteria to set the dog up for success. Yeah. And that this is just part of it. And for me, being heavily, dependent on treating the dogs, it's great to have some other possibilities, to keep trying as some of the criteria to change up. I love it.
Yeah. And dog models. If you've got a dog that I've had a lot of dogs learn with a helper dog. So I'll ask the helper dog to do something that's already part of our, communication. And then the learner dog will see the helper dog do it and begin to mimic that. Mm-hmm. And then I didn't have to do anything directly. The teacher dog did it better. Yeah, there's just so much creativity around this.
That's awesome. Any other ones that you can think of that you want to mention before we sign off?
Let's see. Well, I think we covered a lot. I'm sure that I'm sure something else is going to come to me, but that stuff's pretty fresh from my current experience.
Yeah, that's awesome.
I think that might be it for now.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I'm going to look up Sarah Fisher.
Yeah.
I might put a link to her stuff in the show notes for everybody else that's interested.
Should be great to check out.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Matt.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Really appreciate it. I appreciate what you're doing and how you do it, and glad to be a part of it.
Oh, thanks. This is your aspiring sensei, Susan Light, signing off. If you want to work with me, you can find me at doggydojopodcast.com. I offer video sessions no matter where you're located. The music was written by Mac Light. You can find him at maclightsongwriter.com. If you liked what you heard, please subscribe, rate, review, and share the podcast with other dog lovers. And I'll see you here next Tuesday with a brand new episode of the Doggy Dojo.